Picture this. It's 1847, high in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The temperature has plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. Snow falls so thick you can barely see your own hands. And somewhere in this frozen wilderness, a lone hunter crouches behind a boulder, waiting for his prey. He's been out here for 3 days straight. No Gore-Tex jacket, no thermal underwear, no hand warmers, just the clothes on his back and knowledge passed down through generations. How is he still alive? While modern adventurers spend thousands of dollars on high-tech gear just to survive a weekend camping trip, our ancestors lived, hunted, and thrived in the world's most brutal mountain environments for months at a time. They had secrets we've almost forgotten, techniques so effective that some indigenous hunters could sleep comfortably in snow caves while temperatures outside dropped to lethal levels. Tonight we're going to uncover those secrets. We're going to explore the forgotten art of surviving in frozen mountains with nothing but wit, skill, and ancient wisdom. Because what they knew might just save your life. Long before REI existed, before anyone dreamed of synthetic insulation or battery-powered heated socks, there were the mountain hunters. These weren't casual weekend warriors. These were people whose very survival depended on their ability to track game through some of the harshest terrain on Earth. Take the Inuit hunters of Alaska and northern Canada. For over 1,000 years, they've hunted in conditions that would kill most modern humans within hours. But here's what's fascinating. They didn't just survive these conditions. They were so comfortable in them that they could hunt for days, sleep outdoors, and return home healthier than when they left. How did they do it? The answer lies in understanding something we've lost in our modern world, the science of layering, but not the kind you think. We're talking about a sophisticated system that went far beyond just putting on more clothes. It was about reading the environment, understanding your body's signals, and working with nature instead of against it. But before we dive into their techniques, let's talk about what they were up against. Mountain hunting wasn't just about cold. It was about altitude sickness, unpredictable weather, avalanches, and the constant threat of getting lost in a whiteout. One wrong decision, one moment of overconfidence, and you became another statistic, another hunter who never came home. Yet somehow, generation after generation managed not just to survive, but to master these conditions. They developed techniques so refined, so perfectly adapted to their environment, that modern science is only now beginning to understand how effective they really were. Let me tell you about Hugh Glass. You might know him from the movie The Revenant, but the real story is even more incredible. In 1823, Glass was mauled by a grizzly bear in what is now South Dakota. His companions, convinced he was going to die, took his weapons and left him for dead. But Glass didn't die. Despite his horrific injuries, despite being alone in the wilderness with winter approaching, he crawled and walked over 200 miles to reach safety. How? He used techniques that mountain hunters had perfected over centuries. Glass understood something crucial. Your biggest enemy in cold weather isn't the temperature itself, it's moisture. Sweat, wet clothes, damp boots, these are what kill you in the mountains. The indigenous hunters knew this instinctively. They had developed what we now call moisture management systems that were more sophisticated than anything we have today. Here's where it gets interesting. Modern outdoor enthusiasts are taught to stay dry at all costs. But the old mountain hunters, they actually used controlled moisture as a survival tool. They knew exactly when to let themselves sweat, and more importantly, when to stop. They could regulate their body temperature with a precision that seems almost supernatural. But there's a darker side to this story. Not everyone who ventured into the mountains with these traditional techniques made it out alive. The mountains are littered with the bones of hunters who made one crucial mistake, who pushed just a little too far beyond they. Forget everything you think you know about winter clothing. The mountain hunters of the past had access to materials that were in many ways superior to what we use today. And I'm not talking about some lost superfabric. I'm talking about understanding how different materials work together in ways we've completely forgotten. Take buffalo hide, for example. A properly prepared buffalo robe wasn't just warm. It was a complete environmental control system. The fur trapped air for insulation, but the hide itself was semi-permeable, allowing moisture to escape while keeping wind and snow out. It was like wearing a primitive version of Gore-Tex, except it worked better. But here's what's really mind-blowing. These hunters didn't just wear animal skins. They created complex layering systems using bird down, plant fibers, and even specially prepared moss. Each layer had a specific purpose, and the entire system could be adjusted on the fly as conditions changed. The Sami reindeer herders of northern Scandinavia perfected this to an art form. They could survive weeks above the Arctic Circle using clothing systems that weighed less than a modern winter jacket. Their secret? They understood that insulation isn't about thickness. It's about trapping air while maintaining breathability. And then there's the controversial theory that some of these techniques were deliberately hidden or lost. Some historians argue that as European colonization spread, indigenous knowledge about cold weather survival was systematically suppressed or simply ignored. The result? We forgot techniques that could have saved countless lives. Consider this. During the Klondike Gold Rush of the 1890s, thousands of prospectors died from exposure despite having access to the best modern gear available at the time. Meanwhile, local indigenous guides wearing traditional clothing survived conditions that killed the well-equipped stampers. Fire. It seems obvious, right? When you're cold, you build a fire. But mountain hunters knew that fire was much more than just a heat source. It was a tool, a weapon, a lifeline, and sometimes the difference between life and death. But not all fires are created equal. The average person builds a fire for warmth. Mountain hunters built fires for survival, and there's a huge difference. They knew how to build fires that would burn all night without attention. They knew how to create coal beds that would stay hot for days. Most importantly, they knew how to build fires that would reflect heat in specific directions, creating warm microclimates even in the worst conditions. Here's a technique that sounds impossible until you understand the physics. Some Native American hunters could create fires so efficient that they could sleep naked next to them in sub-zero temperatures and wake up warm and dry. The secret wasn't the fire itself. It was the reflector system they built around it. Using strategically placed rocks and branches, they would create heat reflectors that bounced warmth back toward their sleeping area while protecting them from wind. The result was a localized warm zone that was actually more comfortable than most modern heated tents. But fire brought its own dangers. A poorly managed fire could give away your position to hostile wildlife. It could melt the snow underneath you, leaving you sleeping in a puddle. Most dangerously, it could create carbon monoxide in enclosed spaces, killing hunters in their sleep. The old-timers had rules for fire management that were passed down like sacred knowledge. Break these rules, and you might not live to regret it. Now let's talk about something that will change how you think about cold weather survival forever. The art of snow shelters. Most people think of snow as the enemy, when you're trying to stay warm. But master mountain hunters knew that snow was actually their best friend. Properly used, snow becomes one of the most effective insulation materials on Earth. The physics are remarkable. Fresh snow is about 90% trapped air, making it an incredible insulator. But here's what's amazing. Experienced hunters could build snow shelters that were actually warmer inside than outside air temperatures, even without any heat source. How is that possible? It comes down to understanding thermal dynamics in ways that most modern survival experts completely miss. The hunters knew that your body heat, properly contained, could warm a small space to comfortable levels. But it required precise construction techniques that took years to master. The Inuit igloo is the most famous example, but it was just one of dozens of snow shelter designs used by mountain hunters around the world. Each design was perfectly adapted to specific snow conditions and weather patterns. But here's where things get controversial. Some modern survival experts claim that these traditional shelters are actually dangerous, that they can collapse and trap you, or that they don't provide adequate ventilation. Others argue that these critics simply don't understand the traditional techniques properly. The truth is probably somewhere in between. These shelters worked incredibly well for people who grew up learning to build them, but they required knowledge and skills that can't be learned from a book or a weekend survival course. Here's something that might surprise you. What mountain hunters ate was just as important as what they wore. Their diet wasn't just about getting enough calories. It was a carefully designed system for maintaining body heat and energy in extreme conditions. Traditional mountain hunters ate foods that seem almost magical in their effectiveness. Pemmican, for example, was a mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries that could provide sustained energy for days. But it wasn't just trail food. It was specifically formulated to help the body generate heat. The fat content was crucial. While modern diets try to minimize fat, mountain hunters knew that fat was their primary fuel for staying warm. They would consume amounts of fat that would horrify a modern nutritionist. But this high-fat diet allowed their bodies to generate heat efficiently, even in extreme cold. They also understood something about timing that we've forgotten. They knew exactly when to eat during long hunts, how much to eat, and what types of food would provide immediate warmth versus sustained energy. But perhaps most importantly, they knew how to find food in environments where modern people would starve. They could identify edible plants buried under snow, knew which tree barks were nutritious, and could catch fish through ice using techniques that seem almost impossible. There's a famous story from the 1930s about a traditional hunter who survived 3 weeks alone in the Canadian Rockies during a blizzard. When rescuers finally found him, he had actually gained weight. He had been living entirely off the land, using knowledge that his grandfather had taught him. But perhaps the most important factor in survival wasn't physical at all. It was mental. Mountain hunters developed psychological techniques for dealing with cold, isolation, and fear that were incredibly sophisticated. They understood that panic kills faster than cold. They knew that fear makes you make bad decisions, and bad decisions in the mountains are often fatal. So they developed mental practices that kept them calm, focused, and rational, even in the most desperate situations. Some of these techniques seem almost mystical. Tibetan hunters practiced forms of meditation that allowed them to generate body heat through mental concentration alone. The practice, known as Tummo, has been studied by modern scientists who confirm that experienced practitioners can indeed raise their body temperature through meditation. But you didn't need to be a master meditator to benefit from these psychological techniques. Simple practices like controlled breathing, positive visualization, and mental games helped hunters stay focused and calm during long, cold nights in the wilderness. They also understood the importance of routine and ritual in maintaining morale. Simple practices like taking care of their gear, following specific procedures for setting up camp, and maintaining personal hygiene all served to keep their minds occupied and their spirits up. The psychological aspect was so important that some hunting cultures had elaborate initiation rituals designed to test not just physical endurance, but mental resilience in cold weather conditions. Not every story has a happy ending. The mountains are full of tragedies, and studying these disasters teaches us just as much as studying the successes. Take the Donner Party of 1846. These pioneers became trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains during one of the worst winters on record. Despite having some knowledge of cold weather survival, most of them died. Why? Because they made one crucial mistake that experienced mountain hunters never would have made. They relied too heavily on their supplies instead of learning to live off the land. The survivors were those who adapted traditional hunting and survival techniques. They learned to find food where others saw only snow and rocks. They learned to read weather patterns and conserve energy. Most importantly, they learned to make decisions based on survival, not comfort. But even experienced hunters sometimes made fatal mistakes. The mountains don't forgive errors, and the difference between life and death often came down to tiny details that seem insignificant until they're not. Weather prediction was one of these crucial skills. Traditional hunters could read signs in the sky, the behavior of animals, and changes in air pressure that warned them of incoming storms. Modern meteorology is more accurate, but it's also less accessible when you're days away from civilization. Some techniques used by traditional mountain hunters were so specialized that they died with their practitioners. We know they existed from historical accounts, but the actual methods were never fully documented. For example, some Plains Indian hunters had a technique for creating instant warmth that involved a specific combination of breathing and muscle control. Witnesses described seeing hunters warm themselves so effectively that steam would rise from their bodies in sub-zero temperatures. But the exact technique was never recorded. Similarly, certain Himalayan hunting cultures had methods for predicting avalanches that were apparently more accurate than modern forecasting techniques. But these methods were closely guarded secrets, passed down only within families, and most were lost when traditional cultures were disrupted. This raises uncomfortable questions about what we've lost in our rush to modernize. How many life-saving techniques disappeared when traditional knowledge was dismissed as primitive superstition? Some researchers are trying to reconstruct these lost arts by studying historical accounts and working with the few remaining traditional hunters. But it's a race against time, as the last practitioners of these ancient skills are aging and passing away. Interestingly, some of the most advanced modern cold weather gear is actually based on principles that traditional hunters understood centuries ago. Military research into cold weather survival has rediscovered many traditional techniques. Special Forces units now train in methods that are remarkably similar to those used by indigenous hunters. The difference is that modern soldiers have the benefit of scientific understanding to explain why these techniques work. For example, the military now teaches a layering system that's almost identical to what Inuit hunters used, but with modern synthetic materials. The principle is the same: create multiple layers of trapped air while maintaining the ability to adjust insulation levels as conditions change. Similarly, modern expedition gear increasingly mimics the design principles of traditional equipment. High-end sleeping bags use construction techniques that are based on traditional fur and down arrangements. Modern shelters incorporate wind-shedding designs that were perfected by nomadic hunters centuries ago. But there's still something missing. Modern gear can replicate the physical properties of traditional equipment, but it can't replicate the knowledge and intuition that came from a lifetime of living in these conditions. Modern science has finally begun to understand why traditional cold weather survival techniques were so effective. The answers lie in physics, biology, and psychology in ways that early hunters understood intuitively. Take the concept of peripheral vasoconstriction. That's the scientific term for what happens when your body restricts blood flow to your extremities to preserve core temperature. Traditional hunters understood this process and developed techniques to manage it effectively. They knew that certain types of movement could force blood back into fingers and toes before frostbite set in. They understood that specific breathing patterns could help maintain circulation. Most importantly, they knew the warning signs that indicated when their body was starting to lose the battle against cold. Modern research has also validated traditional understanding of how different materials interact with moisture. The complex layering systems used by traditional hunters weren't just based on tradition. They were based on accurate understanding of how heat, moisture, and air movement work together. Recent studies have even confirmed that some traditional foods really did provide superior nutrition for cold weather survival. The high fat content and specific nutrient combinations weren't just cultural preferences. They were scientifically optimal for maintaining body heat and energy in extreme conditions. But not everything traditional hunters believed was accurate. Some traditional practices, while well-intentioned, were actually dangerous or ineffective. For example, the idea that alcohol warms you up was common among many hunting cultures, but we now know that alcohol actually increases heat loss by dilating blood vessels. Many hunters died because they relied on alcohol for warmth instead of proper techniques. Similarly, some traditional shelters, while effective in specific conditions, could be deadly if built incorrectly or used in the wrong circumstances. The difference was that traditional hunters learned these techniques through years of careful instruction and practice. Modern people trying to replicate them from books or videos often miss crucial details. There's also the myth of the natural human ability to survive extreme cold. While traditional hunters were incredibly tough and skilled, they weren't superhuman. They survived because of knowledge, preparation, and technique, not because they were somehow naturally more resistant to cold than modern people. Understanding these myths is important because it helps us separate the genuinely useful traditional knowledge from the cultural beliefs that might have been based on incomplete understanding. Perhaps the greatest mystery isn't how traditional hunters survived the cold. It's how they thrived in it. Historical accounts describe hunters who seemed to actually prefer winter hunting, who were more comfortable in sub-zero mountains than in warm settlements. What psychological and physical adaptations allowed humans to not just survive, but to genuinely enjoy living in conditions that most of us consider barely survivable? Some researchers believe the answer lies in understanding how human physiology can adapt to extreme conditions over time. Traditional hunters often showed remarkable physical adaptations: enlarged lung capacity from living at altitude, increased circulation from constant cold exposure, and enhanced night vision from long winter months. But the psychological adaptations might have been even more important. These hunters developed a completely different relationship with their environment. Instead of seeing the mountain winter as an enemy to be defeated, they saw it as a partner to be understood and worked with. This shift in perspective changed everything about how they approached cold weather survival. They weren't fighting against the cold, they were dancing with it. So what can we learn from these masters of mountain survival? Their secrets weren't really secret at all. They were just forgotten. They understood that survival in extreme cold isn't about having the best gear or the most calories. It's about understanding your environment, respecting its power, and working with natural systems instead of against them. They knew that your mind is your most important survival tool, that panic kills faster than cold, and that the difference between life and death often comes down to tiny details that seem insignificant until they matter most. But perhaps most importantly, they understood something we've lost in our modern world, that humans are incredibly adaptable creatures, capable of thriving in environments that seem impossible to survive. The next time you're struggling with your thermostat on a mildly cold day, remember the hunter crouching in that Sierra Nevada blizzard. Remember that somewhere in your genetic memory, you carry the same potential for adaptation and survival that kept our ancestors alive in the world's most brutal conditions. The mountains are still there, still cold, still dangerous. But the knowledge of how to survive in them doesn't have to die with the last traditional hunters. It's waiting to be rediscovered, waiting to be understood, waiting to save lives. The question is, are we wise enough to listen to the lessons written in snow and carved in ice by those who came before us? What other secrets might be hidden in the practices we've dismissed as primitive? What other lost knowledge might be the key to not just surviving, but thriving in the challenges that lie ahead? The mountains remember. The question is, will we? If this journey into forgotten survival wisdom fascinated you, there's so much more to discover. From the mysterious techniques of Arctic whalers to the incredible endurance secrets of high-altitude Sherpa guides, the world is full of survival knowledge waiting to be uncovered. Join us as we continue exploring the incredible ways humans have adapted to Earth's most extreme environments.